improve my posture. There we go.
Hello, this is Pat Lynch, and you are listening and watching As the World Turns or Burns. And with us is the crack team. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. And then always behind the board is...
Producer Cheyenne.
Yes, so it's an all-star cast. And today, goodness, this is a kind of a news commentary show, and the darn news moves pretty fast. But what are we going to be talking about today, guys? What are the things that...
A little bit of tariffs, a little bit of Ukraine again, maybe. The press conference. Whatever we want to call it.
State of the Union or...
State of the Union we could talk about. There's a lot.
Yeah. Okay, well, where do we want to begin first?
I guess we can start with tariffs because that'll probably change the most between now and whenever people watch this.
Yeah. So, thoughts?
Well, I think tariffs, they're being used in a very atypical way by the Trump administration right now, because they're kind of being used like sanctions, which that's what sanctions are. It's usually not a tax, but usually banning the import or export of certain goods. And that's kind of how it's being used, because there is an argument that maybe you could agree or disagree with it, but there's a valid argument for maybe imposing tariffs maybe on the margins. So, usually how tariffs are pitched is you're protecting domestic industries, because the whole point of putting up trade protection is it makes foreign goods more expensive relative to your domestic goods. So if you buy more American-made goods, that's actually good for creating jobs and raising wages, at least in those industries. I was very careful to... Because the net effects of trade protection are probably negative is the consensus. But again, there is that kind of argument for instituting tariffs. The way, though, that tariffs are being wielded right now by the Trump administration, again, is more of strong arming and trying to coerce foreign nations to do stuff that is arguably unrelated to trade, whether it's stemming immigration or, the fentanyl trade or whatever drug trade. Or just using it just because, I don't know, we want Greenland, or just using it to be tough and America first. So it's that's the first thing I could say, is just the way that tariffs are being pitched is not the traditional way we see tariffs usually pitched to the American public.
Well, it's kind of it's a muscular kind of trade and foreign policy, and that that the U.S. is always they've had all this economic clout. We got this biggest economy, the biggest military, and we just never utilize. We always kind of try to get along, and everybody takes advantage of us. And so with Trump, it comes in and it's like, guys, that's over, and it's. He's flipping the script, and so now he's using that all that clout, that muscle that he perceives the U.S. has to get whatever it is that's best for America first. So the Canadians, they've always got the better end of the deal. No more Mexicans, they got the better end of the deal. Forget about that, and then. Check right on down the list. Every other trade partner we have, it's like he's just kind of flipping the script, and it's I'm not here to be nice. I'm here to get the best deal. Is that kind of sound like what he's trying to do?
I think he views the world in a zero-sum game. If the U.S. is giving anything up, that means we're losing. One side can't one side, you can't both win. I guess what it comes down to. Like,
it's the Ricky
if
Bobby,
someone else is doing well, therefore you are losing. I guess the better way of
Ricky
putting
Bobby philosophy. You're either first or last.
Yeah, very winners or losers mentality. The tariffs are strange, and I think the ones on Canada are particularly odd because he's talking about fentanyl. That's his reason to Justin Trudeau why he's putting these tariffs on Canada is him. I guess he's delayed it again, but might put tariffs on Canada again in the future. But only, I think it's like 0.2% of fentanyl that enters the U.S. is coming from Canada, so that's not very many. Yeah. There's not much illegal immigration coming across the board from Canada.
That's
like primarily
2%.
It's very small. It's primarily coming across the southern border, and so I think Trudeau believes, and a lot of Canadians believe, that he wants to punish Canada economically so that they'll become the 51st state, I guess. It seems ridiculous, but it's not completely out of the question. And I think Trudeau and a lot of other Canadians feel that way.
They're economically dependent on the U.S., and so you kind of cripple them in a certain way, then that'll just give you the opportunity to get a better deal and yet a better deal.
Yeah, the Canadian economy is very interlinked to the American economy. I don't remember exact what percentage of trade we make up with with Canada, but it's really high. It's going to affect them more than it would affect us. And I think Trump sees that the American economy is a lot bigger than the Canadian economy. It's a lot bigger than the Mexican economy. Right. Even if you combine them, it's a lot bigger than the two economies combined. Yeah. And they just don't have the economic clout to push back in the way that would really damage us as much as we can damage them.
The other thing that came out of when he pulled back on some of the tariffs was that he also was doing it with a motivation of bringing more production back to the U.S. You guys read that, and it was kind of farcical that it's like he gave like the U.S. automakers like 30 days to kind of move production into the United States, and that's always like that's many years in the process, but make it happen in a month. But I think the point is that it's just you're there. Here you are. You got automotive manufacturing in Detroit, right over the river. You got an assembly plant in Windsor or somewhere up in in Ontario province, and it's like, and that's just there's obviously economic reasons why the manufacturers do that. Same with Mexico, and he's just kind of taking the whole table with the cards and just turning it over and saying, let's just do a whole reset, and he wants everything returned back home.
And that's a little closer to kind of the traditional economic case for putting up tariffs or forms of trade protection is right, so we had NAFTA, or it's called USMCA now, but what was formerly NAFTA lowers trade barriers to practically zero. By doing that, though, you maybe create incentives where if you are an American firm, you're going to go to where it's cheapest to produce your product. So you go to where labor is cheaper. Labor is going to be cheaper in Mexico than the United States, and so that is actually true about, an open trade policy. There are distributional effects. There's winners and losers, just like any other policy. The problem, though, nowadays is everything, like all the supply chains are across international borders, right? So it's global supply chains. So, businesses are not really purely American, purely Mexican, purely anything. Like most businesses, they're multinational. Even I think international trade about some crazy number, I want to say it's like a third of it is actually within companies. Right. Meaning you're trading products. Let's say you're making cars, you're sourcing the tires from a subsidiary in another country.
Right.
And then those tires, they are sourcing rubber or whatever from another foreign country. So if you start putting up tariffs, it's not just affecting consumers. Like I hear it in the news a lot, like prices going up for consumers, which is also true. But really, I think where the most of the damage happens is with the companies, because all this stuff is going to have second order effects and disrupting those global supply chains, which is going to raise prices even further and ends up you're hurting American businesses rather than you think it helping. So that's the wrench in the works for the logic of.
Oh yeah. You, something, Kieran, or?
No, I mean
Yeah.
that sounds right. I mean, Brendan knows more about international trade than I
Yeah.
do. That sounds right to me. I think the origin of tariffs is a way of protecting industry to promote development. And during his first term, Trump did do some targeted tariffs. I think he tariffed steel from China, if I recall it correctly. And I think there were some studies that have shown that did produce some manufacturing jobs in the U.S., although it might have cost more jobs overall through
A lot
its
of
other effects.
agriculture too, and then he ended up kind of subsidized. He kind of had tariffs on a bunch of agricultural products, and then he ended up subsidizing a bunch. Because there was a retaliatory tariff, and then he would subsidize a lot of the different, like farmers and everything to try and balance it. And it's. I don't know. It's not an easy unraveling what this is trying to do, because like going back to, I'm familiar, like being from Michigan, with the automotive industry, and it truly is a global supply chain that builds automobiles. And then you even look at uh like quote unquote imports. They have production plants all over the Southeast, BMW, Toyota, Mercedes, and the list goes on, Nissan. So is that a domestic product or an import? And then what goes into, putting a tariff on there? The other thing with tariffs is that it was always about unfair competition, dumping, things like that. And that never seems to come into the conversation, at all.
Yeah, well, that stuff still exists. I mean, there are, those are, I think, perfectly legitimate reasons to impose what would be retaliatory tariffs. So, we have those processes set up already in our Department of Commerce and some other federal agencies as well, where they act as basically they serve a judicial function of just trying to sort out, are there foreign companies that are artificially lowering their prices, dumping their products, driving American businesses out of competition, and then raising them. And they find sometimes that that's the case. The U.S. has a weird system of calculating anti-dumping and the damage, which is a controversial thing. But again, that's something that's already happened. That's been well before Trump. And international law also allows that to happen. So there are these exceptions to when tariffs are okay. But again, the way that tariffs right now are being imposed is just very atypical, I think.
What's the weird system in terms of how they would calculate dumping? Is it like below that there's like a certain cost of goods, and then they measure that if you're selling below that with the effort, or what, or how, how's it work?
It's called zeroing. So how it works is you have to calculate, and man, I can only imagine how much data this is, but you've got to calculate all of the products and transactions that a company does selling their goods to the United States. Take, an average of how many times was the price the same as U.S. products, slightly above, or sorry, how was the price compared to the price it costs to make the product? Sorry. It's not compared to American prices.
Right.
Sometimes it's higher. Sometimes it's lower. You take the average of that. So the average ends up being lower than the cost it took to produce it. That's the definition of dumping. You're operating at a loss intentionally. But what the U.S. will do is whenever they're actually producing over the cost of what it cost to produce, they zero it, and just rather than treat it as, got it reversed, as a negative number, they put it back to zero, which in short, it just biases it so that you're more likely to find evidence of dumping. And the World Trade Organization, I think, has ruled at least once that this is not the way you should do things. Maybe other countries do it, but the U.S. is the only country I'm familiar that does this controversial zeroing strategy.
Right.
So
yeah, because even with just going through all those formulas, that I think about solar panels that the Chinese manufacturers essentially killed U.S. manufacturing of solar panels. They targeted that particular segment as like kind of strategic and something they wanted to own, and yeah, there's probably some cost advantage that they had, but I think it was more just just undercutting the price and just wiping the floor with all of them.
For sure. It does happen, yeah. And the U.S. will, in the past at least, it's taken China to court at the World Trade Organization.
But after all, the U.S. solar manufacturers are shut. They've closed shop.
True. But what, the U.S. could not only win concessions at the WTO to have them change their policy, but you could actually get monetary compensation through the WTO. Now, will China abide by a WTO ruling is another question, but that's actually an argument for why we need something like the World Trade Organization, which since the first Trump administration, it's been pretty much defunct, the judicial function of it at least.
Right.
There's no more judges because the U.S. keeps vetoing judges.
So, what is the current administration view of the WTO? I mean, we're out of WHO. We may be out of NATO sometime. I mean, it's like any international agreement seems to be kind of written off at this point.
If this was a month ago, I would say that the U.S. will talk bad about the WTO, but we're not going to exit it because it's just such a vital institution and it's all political theater. But right now, in March 2025, I would actually put better odds, and we probably will leave this thing eventually. It just seems like that's the way the wind's blowing.
Not in our interest. Yeah, we don't.
Yeah, it's not deemed to be in our interest. And with just how debilitated that organization has become because of politics, not just the U.S. vetoing judges, but there's been a lot of gridlock at that institution. It really has become ineffective. So unless you do something to fix it, the WTO is not really doing much right now, in my opinion. But
it's a broader withdrawal from international institutions by Trump. What did we just leave? The World Health Organization a few weeks ago. And NATO, I think, is on the table. We'll see if that actually happens or not, but I wouldn't be shocked if it happened in the next few years. But I think a lot of this is stoking like anti-Americanism around the world. If you look at Canada, very, very famously in Canada, I've seen the booing of the American national anthem. And there's always been like I think a part of Canadian identity that is like anti-Americanism, that we're like a different version of North America. But now, I mean, I don't know, would I want to go to Canada right now? I'm not sure how positively Americans will be received there. And I mean, we'll see what happens. But if you look at the election in Canada, like Trump has totally upended Canadian politics. If you go back to I don't know, October or whatever, the Liberals, they were dead. It was over. They were going to lose. Trudeau's ratings were in the dumpster. He announced that he was stepping down. So there's currently about to wrap up the Liberal Party leadership election. And now, I mean, the Conservatives still might win, but Liberals have a shot. Polling is much, much closer.
Yeah.
And I think the main issue in Canadian politics shifted from really economics, like how can we get the Canadian economy going, to who can handle Trump the best. Yeah. And that sort of changed the perception of how voters are going to decide who they're going to vote for, their decision-making process.
The Liberal candidate, that the woman that was his former finance.
Chrystia Freeland.
Freeland. Yeah, she's impressive. I mean, I've seen her on interviews, and
she lived in the U.S. for a long time. But she was an editor at the Nation.
Yeah,
somebody could fact check me on that. She was an editor of a major publishing paper in the U.S. She's been making the rounds recently. But I think their election wraps up in the next few days, so we'll find out who's going to succeed Trudeau. And I think whoever wins the Liberal Party leadership will probably call for a quick election because they want to have the election while this is still all very salient.
Right.
In that way, they can probably have better odds of winning a general election against Pierre Poilievre, who's the Conservative candidate. Another thing, too, is like this whole fentanyl thing. I thought about this quite a bit. Trump wants to punish Canada and Mexico for fentanyl coming into the U.S. If you look at Mexico, this was about to go before the Supreme Court, a case on this issue, where like the amount of guns, American guns, that make their way into Mexico and kill Mexicans because they're being used by the cartel.
Sure.
Couldn't Mexico be like, you know what, Trump, you're damaging Mexican lives, you're leading to however many Mexicans die every year from cartel violence, the vast majority of which is used with American-made weapons.
Right.
Therefore, we're going to put tariffs up on you until until you do something about the illegal transport of guns from the U.S. into Mexico. Yeah. It just seems like that'd be intellectually consistent if we're going to go in the same kind of philosophy.
Yeah. Oh gosh. But look, kind of, where's this thing going to be 6 months or a year from now?
Who knows? I think it could change in so many different directions.
Yeah, but I mean, there has to be some end point. I mean, we saw it before in the first administration, but kind of he's just used. It's all isn't it all in negotiation, and he's just looking for something that that's the deal. I mean, it's not. I mean, they Canada, didn't they add like some additional border security and some
they have a fentanyl czar now.
Fentanyl czar, okay, but that isn't enough. So he keeps pushing it, and kind of where I'm going with this is that I think there's a point where the business community is going to have to just say you have to stop at some point. We just can't operate efficiently if you're changing our whole environment, every week. No, we can't move production to the U.S. in a month. No, how are we going to handle a 10%, 20%, 25% increase in cost of goods coming into this country? It's I think that there's going to just be a point that, please, there's a lot of ways you can negotiate, but you have to stop doing this. If you want to put a tariff, go ahead, put a tariff. We'll disagree, but just stick with it. This, reprieves and all this. This is just, I think, is just causing way too much uncertainty. And he always looks at like the stock market as being a barometer, and I think they're going to just start voting, and you're going to see, when you get a few more, weeks of decline, then it'll become pretty loud and clear. He has to back off or do, kind of take a more consistent path. I mean, Brendan, what do you think?
And by connection, there will be people within the Republican Party that will start pushing back if this keeps going on.
Yeah.
So Trump he's going to have to be careful about that, because then it could just turn into total chaos and ineffectiveness in Congress if he's got a bunch of Republicans within the party that start pushing against Trump because he's doing this stuff that's damaging business, and these business interests, they give money. They get voters out in congressional elections, which will be here before we know it in less than 2 years. So that's, my prediction, I guess, is, it's already had disruptive effects. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't put up the tariffs, just the threat of tariffs creates uncertainty, is the word I would use. And uncertainty is generally bad for economic growth and stability. So it's already having effects. I think in the end, it's going to cause disruption. I don't know if it's going to totally tank the U.S. economy or cause rampant inflation, because I question if Trump's really going to go ahead with all these tariffs.
Right.
Like we've said, I think he's using it more as a bargaining tactic, but one that's disruptive nonetheless. So.
Yeah, very hard to predict. Something else I want to bring up while we're still on the issue of tariffs is whether or not the president should even have control over tariffs. If you look at the Constitution is very clear. This is not very ambiguous. There are parts of the Constitution that are ambiguous. This is not one. But Article 1, Section 8 says that commerce is the domain of Congress. So Congress is control commerce. And that has been, Congress basically gave that power away starting in the 1930s, and then even more so in the 60s and 70s. And since then, it's really just been the domain of the president. But I don't know, if you're doing an original reading of the Constitution, I don't know how you make that argument.
Right.
It seems pretty explicit to me if you read the letter of the Constitution that is a power of Congress, not the executive.
Well, you're only an originalist when it suits you, isn't that kind of how it always works?
Maybe. I don't know. You look at like how it happened. Like it's just initially they gave a little bit of power away, and over time there's a little bit more power away, and eventually pretty much all power over tariffs and trade was handed over to the executive. So we talked about it a few weeks ago. The expanding power of the presidency in terms of like declaring war effectively, making treaties. And this is another example where I think if you read the Constitution, it's not really a power the executive should have, but just the way things have evolved over the last 90 years, that's how things work now.
And it's ironic, too, because the whole reason that power was delegated away was because Congress was terrible at trade liberalization. They were actually the more protectionist branch because the constituencies of Congress are smaller, especially for the House. So you're catering to special interests that maybe your special interests do gain from tariffs. Even if tariffs hurt the nation as a whole, they benefit your voters. So that's what would happen. I mean, that's what happened on the tail end of the Great Depression. There was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And then, gradually over time, starting with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, the RTAA, that was delegated to the president, and then later on there was the Trade Expansion Act. And the president was a more pro-trade branch or a pro-trade actor because they represent the nation as a whole. But now, it's just added to the list of things that have been turned on their head now in the Trump era. Everything is upside down. So maybe if Democrats were to somehow gain control of both chambers again, they could maybe take away that delegation of trade authority, but then that might just lead to more tariffs anyway, so who knows?
Well, speaking of the world turned upside down, let's talk Ukraine.
Yes. Let's talk Ukraine.
Now, we went with that was a week ago with the White House meeting with
6
Zelensky.
days ago.
Why does it seem like a month ago? It's and isn't that it was kind of like those pivotal moments. Like you're going to remember that day, and to me that just seemed like one that I could not believe something like that would happen, and and it would be and our president would be kind of saying this to an ally that's under war, and it seems like the whole foreign policy has just been complete. It was being redefined, but it just became in real stark clarity at that moment. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, it was a very bizarre scene where people have been speculating whether or not it was intentional, whether or not Vance and Trump wanted to provoke Zelensky and sort of ambushed him. It's kind of hard to tell. Maybe they did. Maybe just they saw an opportunity and went for it. At least Vance. I think Vance is the one who really provoked it. But the whole thing was like watching somebody get bullied. It was a bullying episode. And Zelensky too. I feel bad for him in that he's doing this in his third language. I think I actually think Russian might be his mother tongue, but obviously Ukrainian and then English. And he speaks English, but his English he's probably not fluent. Like doesn't speak perfect English. And so he's being ganged up on, and they've got all these. The reporters there are just, some of them are ridiculous, like yelling at him for not wearing a suit. Like, does anybody? It doesn't really matter,
right?
And so that definitely set off alarm bells. I think a lot of Western Europe and in Canada, as well. Everybody's part of NATO. That Trump just. I don't know, he's not afraid to absolutely rip Zelensky, but he won't say a single bad thing about Putin, which is just really strange. And nobody's figured out why that is. It's just been how Trump has been, since he started running for president. He won't say one bad thing about Putin, but our allies, he's not afraid to rip as much as he wants to.
Sure.
I feel like I've seen in middle school like similar bullying dynamics. It was like started with Vance, and then there was other people in the room that was just like, I'm just gonna do this because everyone else is doing this. I felt so bad for Zelensky watching that. Like that was hard to watch because he was just defeated, and it was. I interpreted it as political theater and Vance getting some sound bites for running for 2028.
Sure.
Just coming off as tough. And the way, like, I'm getting a good handle on Vance now. Like, I feel like a lot of, if he has like a press conference coming up or something where he knows the cameras are going to be on, he's very good at getting in his head. Here's the message I'm going to say. Like, it seems very premeditated, and he's
he's intelligent, and
he's politically savvy. He knows what he's a politically correct sort of person for going against people for being politically correct in a weird way.
Yeah.
He is a more, I think, polished, presidential looking Trump, I guess, in some way. There was, though, one little dig that Zelensky got, which most people, I think, aren't talking about, which is
Here comes the hot take.
he called Vance out for like, where are you getting this information from? You've never been on the front line.
Yeah.
And Vance, you could tell Vance there had to go off script and start stuttering a little bit.
Right,
And it's
right.
like, I've read the media headlines. I've read,
Right,
it's
yeah,
like, well, I thought it was fake news, but
Sure.
but yeah, it's I don't know, playing political theater and doing these things while a nation's at war and people are literally dying is just, I don't even know what to say about it. So,
And that's something too that I think even people who are maybe not all that supportive of Ukraine will look at that and say, "Oh, that was kind of bad behavior." There'll be the very strong MAGA group that will support Trump no matter what. But I think there's some people who are maybe not very liberal, but still wouldn't support Trump's behavior and Vance's behavior in the Oval Office there.
But it was kind of the moment kind of brought to me like since 1945, basically 80 years, there's been like a certain international order, that the U.S. was a fundamental part of that, in terms of, the Marshall Plan and just our role in the world in terms of just trying to promote, democracy, promote like development, progress, and that when nations all rise, everyone benefits. That to try and contain the spread of communism so that it wouldn't take over, and so you had all these alliances made, all these the NATO established, and it seemed like the Trump administration kind of just set off a stick of dynamite in that whole thinking of the past 80 years, and is kind of rethinking all of this, and kind of the end game is kind of Europe. You have to protect yourself. We're done kind of helping you. Ukraine. Since that meeting, now they're basically on their own, right? No, they're holding out on weapons. They're holding out on like intelligence sharing, and we just talked. We went after our trade, Canada and Mexico, some of our closest allies and trade partners, but it's this whole the whole kind of way of of how the world works and our role in the world is right now just kind of all getting redefined.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I'm like a little more skeptical of some of the U.S.'s behavior in like the post-World War II world than maybe some other people are, where the U.S. has not always supported democracy. The U.S. was very happy to prop up right-wing dictatorships during the Cold War.
Sure.
If they were anti-communist,
Right.
Whether that be like the apartheid government in South Africa, whether that be Salvador Allende in Chile. But I would agree that like the U.S. has supported democracy in many cases in the last 80 years, and Trump certainly is not part of that worldview. I don't know that he really, based on his behavior in 2020, I don't think he really believes in democracy all that much.
Yeah.
He's not a big believer in small d democracy, and I don't think he sees much need for the U.S. to be involved in international affairs, except in the way that it benefits the U.S. He doesn't see, I think, the importance of staying true to bilateral or multilateral agreements. So he's definitely trying to change things in ways that are that would upend the consensus on American foreign policy for going back many years.
Yeah, and that for the U.S. we've been played as suckers. Europe is, Europe, Japan, they've all been able to ride our coattails. We amassed the world's biggest military and defense, and then they get to not have to spend an adequate amount, and they get the benefit of using us. All the trade deals, in his mind are all, we should be getting a much better deal, and we're not, and we're just, and let's end being nice people and just let's start to get ours. I mean, at Zelensky meeting, the the purpose of the meeting was they were to extract this mineral deal from them in order to quote unquote repay us. I mean, that's has that been done in this country since forever? Yeah, there's some real politic and cool, cool, like bare knuckle deal making, but it just seems like it's just, to me, very different.
Yeah, Trump's definitely changing the direction of American foreign policy. There's no doubt about that. I think, and if you go back pre-Trump, I think any American president in the post-World War II era would be enthusiastically supporting Ukraine. Right. Trump's the only one, I think, post-World War II president, if they were in the same situation, who in this situation who would not support Ukraine with all the enthusiasm that he has.
I'll add one more thing too. So, like, for all the oddities of Trump that we keep talking about, just thinking about it now, I do still think that this rejection of, you mentioned like the global economic order and the setup of things, I think I view Trump more of a symptom rather than a cause of that. So what I mean by that is, I think like as odd as the Trump administration is right now, I think the writing's been on the wall for some time, just with the American public being skeptical of international organizations and this isolationism and rejection of globalization. Right. And I think a number of like more systemic things explain that. The first is like when we set up these institutions after World War II and when the U.S. decided to kind of play the leading role exiting World War II on setting up world politics and setting up the UN and the World Trade Organization, or what was GATT initially, there was like a implicit, like almost like a social contract where we were going to embrace free trade and we were going to be more open and international, but there was going to be some social democracy is the word I'd use. So there would be, a safety net to cushion people against the blows of the, depressions and the losers of an open trade policy. And somewhere along the lines that went away, and you'll hear more progressive economists that talk about hyper globalization. Yeah. And if you just drive around to Rust Belt cities in the United States, you'll know what they're talking about, where there's some cities that have been totally gutted because they can't compete with foreign products from other countries. So when you create then this big disenfranchised or a disadvantaged part of your population that is being hurt by all these policies, I think a lot of that is channeled into either the Trumpian Republicans or even like the Bernie Sanders progressive contingent, right? Bernie Sanders is also very skeptical of things like NAFTA, and maybe for different reasons. The other thing too is I think the war in Afghanistan and Iraq have radically changed things and caused this Vietnam syndrome renewed, where there is, since that time, especially since like the global financial crisis, there's been a skepticism to send boots in on the ground. Right. And I actually think that's in part why Putin felt it would be okay to, or not okay, but at least there wouldn't be a strong U.S. Counter response to invading Crimea and then invading mainland Ukraine, because he knows that American voters can't stomach it. Yeah. So all these things, you could tell all these things I'm saying without referring to Trump, but I do think that's why we got Trump in 2016, and now it's grown into something entirely different and very cult-like. But yeah, that's why I kind of think that all this has been boiling under the surface, and now all of a sudden,
with Russia, let's talk that for a moment, because it's interesting, because under the premise that they want peace in Ukraine, I think what they really want is normalization of relationships with Russia, and that Ukraine's in the way, and so this is peace, but basically it's surrender, because there's no talk about anything from the Russian side, like a ceasefire or anything. It's just Ukraine's an inconvenience towards what Trump wants, which is that normalization, and now let's get back to business, and let's bring them in, lift the sanctions, get back, let's get let's get the band back together, and and then kind of almost like the way the Chinese view foreign policy, where then at that point we'll just do business together. In Russia, we're not going to tell you what to do anymore. Kind of that's you want to move it, you move into Ukraine or anywhere. That's your thing. We got our thing. You do you. And I mean, disagree?
I think there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah.
I think I've read that Trump is interested in opening up more economic ties from the U.S. and Russia,
Yeah.
which were largely cut off with the Ukraine war and when all the American businesses pulled out as part of the attempt to punish Russia for the invasion. I also think the whole minerals deal, which you just mentioned, is a little strange. And I guess the idea is that if the U.S. has an economic tie into Ukraine, therefore the U.S. will protect its interests should Russia invade Ukraine.
That's our
But how would it not just maybe be if Russia decides to invade Ukraine in 2 years again to restart the invasion, that maybe Trump will just work out a deal with Putin where Putin will allow the U.S. to maintain its interests in whatever rare earth metals, minerals in eastern Ukraine, and that the U.S. won't do anything to help Ukraine this time. I don't know.
Well, these push, all of a sudden you hear like the administration talk about Zelensky being a dictator, and you hear this quiet thing about why don't they have an election? And yes, it's a wartime. He is a wartime president. You don't have elections in wartime. But, the whole thing with Zelensky even being there was the last time, that was his predecessor was, basically, put in there by the Russians and then pushed out by the Ukrainian people. And now, it's like, okay, let's put it up for a vote again and then they'll come, the Russians will come in all guns blazing to try to influence it to get back to what was the president before Zelensky?
Well, it was Poroshenko, who was not pro-Putin. The guy before him was Yanukovych, who was pro-Russia.
And he's living in Russia right now.
I think so. Yeah.
So, but again, it just, you always wonder, what is it with Trump? Why would this, you never hear anything about, bad about Russia. And I try to rationalize it that there's just more of an economic motive, that, he just sees that if you normalize things, it'll just open up all these economic avenues.
And just doesn't want war and is willing to take peace even if it's an unjust peace.
Yeah.
Is how I would view it. That's my read on it, at least. Yeah.
I can't call it I call it a surrender. It's just because Ukraine gets nothing, right? They all the territory lost is their borders are redefined and there's no security guarantees, and then they're just going to be. It's more or less like almost a ceasefire, which is tough.
That's really what started the argument in the Oval Office. Zelensky's talking about having some kind of security guarantee, which he doesn't feel like there is one right now, which there isn't. But it sounds like Europe might be coming to his aid in some form. We'll see how those negotiations play out, I guess, in the next few weeks. I think Trump's idea of wanting to end the war is a very reasonable idea. This war has been deadly, tens of thousands of people have died. It's grounded into a World War I sort of stalemate where neither side has made substantial progress. Russia was making some progress for a little while there, but I think Ukraine has kind of pushed back a little bit recently. And so wanting to end the war, I think, is very reasonable. But from, I'm sure, Zelensky's perspective, I think his view is, why am I going to end the war unless there's some kind of guarantee to protect me in case Putin tries to finish the job in a few years?
Yeah.
And until he gets that, it's hard. I mean, Zelensky also, we tend to, I think, when Americans think about foreign policy, put the U.S. at the center of everything. But Zelensky has to think about his own people. How are the Ukrainian people going to respond if he accepts some, very weak peace terms that Trump negotiates, which basically entails no security guarantee against a future Russian invasion?
Do you think the Ukrainians can hold up with entirely European support?
I was reading about that. So I think it sounds like to me the consensus is that Europeans, and if we throw in Canada as well, they have the GDP to do it, but it's a matter of getting the manufacturing up to speed. And you also have the political will. are the people of these various European democracies going to have the desire for a long-term support of Ukraine in against Russia when the U.S. is not going to be able to play any sort of role? Will not play any sort of role in helping Ukraine. So like right now, I think I have to look again at the numbers, but it's been roughly equal between the U.S. and Europe in terms of support for Ukraine, and so you roughly have to double what you've been doing, which is obviously substantial.
Yeah.
And so are European taxpayers willing to do that? Maybe for a little while, but eventually they probably will get tired of it.
Putin will wait him out and basically still achieve what he wants to do. Who knows how many people have to die in the process, but sad. Speaking of sad, the State of the Union. Did you watch it?
I watched the first bit of it, and then I watched some of the highlights later on.
I made breakfast and was listening to like the first hour. I think I got through.
You got man. I couldn't.
It's just I put it on as like background music when I was cooking some oatmeal.
Oh gosh, I made it to when that the guy from Texas got himself booted out. That was
yeah.
I thought I
Al
can't
Green.
get much better than that.
Yeah. There was. Did you see the part or hear the part where he was talking about the African nation of Lesotho?
No.
Oh man, this is. I couldn't believe he said this. Because it was almost. You're familiar with The Onion, right? The kind of satire. Yeah. That's what it sounded like. There's an old Onion skit, I guess, where they have like fake State Department officials saying they didn't know where Andorra was, and they thought Andorra was an African nation when it's really a very wealthy European nation.
Yeah.
And that's like what it reminded me of, because what did he say? He was going on like this laundry list of things that were getting cut because he's talking about Doge. And he's like, we also cut, this amount of funding for this thing in Lesotho. He didn't pronounce it correctly. And then he goes, no one even knows where that is. And then moved on. I was like, I can't believe he just said that.
And Lesotho, it's on the front page of the newspaper today, or probably the day after the speech it was.
Yeah. Oh, God. The one thing, we can talk about Trump's performance, but I'll talk directly in the camera. Democrats, get it together. That was the most embarrassing show. I don't like Trump. I'm going to be mean and put a little placard that says something mean and nasty. It's like, just, if you disagree, don't show up. Just stay home or get, I guess grow a pair or so. It's just, it was, to me, just sad. Mm-hmm. It was sad, even the guy from Houston, getting up and what was it about cuts for Medicaid or what?
Right. Yeah. They didn't have a mandate to cut Medicaid or something, so he was shouting at Trump.
It's like you give them all the sound bites. Now, what is he? He's a victim. It's it's like, gosh, it was just the absolute wrong way to do it. I would just stayed home. Just let it be an empty half of the floor, and just that would say all you need to say.
I heard that the Democrats are planning some kind of protest like that. I remember thinking beforehand that's not really a good idea. I just think the voters that need to win over are going to look at that and be like, "Oh, why are they being disruptive? Why are they being disrespectful?" I just don't think it's going to help anybody.
Yeah. It was just now back to the speech. Was it a surprise how personal it was? I mean, because he had no problem throwing shade at Biden, leftists, woke, just all the worthless people that that they have laid off. It's it was just it was pretty darn harsh.
Yeah, there's nothing surprising with Trump. You hear this every once in a while where people are like, well, we are shocked and surprised that Trump did X, Y, and Z. I've been watching this guy the last 10 years. There's nothing surprising about him. Like, you have to always expect the unexpected.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen. Nothing shocks me with him. Yeah, I mean, it was very personal. He's blaming Biden for everything, which I think still works at this point because it's still very early in his administration. So Trump is not going to get the flack for prices being high at this point still. They're still high in 6 months, he will. But right now, he's going to be able to blame it on Biden. And enough people will be like, oh, he's only been president for 6 weeks. That makes sense. He did mention the eggs, blaming Biden for the egg prices, which I think he's setting himself up pretty well, because if there's anything that's going to go down in price in the future, it's probably eggs, because eventually the bird flu will be resolved, and then egg prices. We have more chickens. Chickens will be born, and they'll lay eggs, and then you'll have egg prices drop down, and Trump will be like, "Oh, look, I lowered egg prices." When probably anybody in office could have lowered egg prices. It won't be anything to do with his policies. But yeah, I mean, it was the the hits as usual that he always goes with. Woke Democrats are bad. Mentioned Greenland. Greenland made an appearance again.
Of course.
Which, again, I think Americans don't realize how terrifying that must be for people in Greenland to see the most powerful country in the world, largest economy in the world, the most powerful person in the world, say, yeah, we're going to take you over, and we're going to find a way to make things work out. And he made it sound like it'll probably be peaceful, but the way he worded it made it sound like there could be a possible military component to it as well. He phrased it in a somewhat ambiguous way that if you wanted to read it as a military hostile takeover, you could read it that way.
Interpret it any way you want. What? Just as he's a masterful marketer. I'll give him that. But where, or was it planned to talk for 100 minutes? That to me, that reminds me of dictators, where they would go and talk for, Castro used to be legendary. He'd have 2 hour, 3 hour kind of just stream of consciousness. And I mean, is it just he gets riffing and he just can't stop, or he thinks the audience loves it? I mean,
I think he loves to talk about himself. It's really all it is.
It's just, because, an effective message, would have been half that time, just get in, but he gets rolling, and of course you got the applause and everything else to kick in, but, what was the strategy of the State of the Union?
Well, I have a question actually. Was this technically a State of the Union address, or was it
not? It's
a joint session of Congress.
Yeah, it's next year will be state. Yeah, I guess anytime it's a.
Okay. I was just wondering because I mean, was there a reason they didn't want to call it one, but it really was one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So, what was his strategy for walking in there? What was he hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, probably just win public opinion and use that mic.
Yeah,
it's just I
say his speech, when he gives speeches, he has every once in a while he's kind of presidential, where he sort of speaks formally. Like when he gave his victory speech after the election, that was relatively a formal speech.
Right.
And then there's the campaign speech where he goes to rallies and just riffs for hours. And this was a hybrid of both, where he kind of took a little bit of both, where it was sort of more presidential than you normally see for him, but there's still all the MAGA rally stuff infused in the speech. So I think he kind of took both elements and put it together.
Yeah. But, it was, I guess if I looked at his strategies, he still wants to kind of say that I have a mandate, right? He didn't win. He won the popular vote, but he didn't win the majority of voters. Is that?
Yeah, I think it was 49.8%. Yeah,
that's a mandate to me.
I think, to be fair, every president claims of a mandate,
right?
Going back forever, no matter how narrow the victory is. But it's true that by the standards of mandates, Trump had a relatively weak mandate. He won the election. There was no ambiguity about it this time, like in 2016, where he lost the popular vote. But it wasn't a decisive victory by any means, even though he presents it as a decisive victory.
And then the radical left-wing lunatics were this close to destroying the country, but I got in, and now it's time to make America great again. And just look at what I've done in my 4 weeks or whatever, and just all the layoffs, the executive orders. America's not woke anymore. And I mean, I look at it and say, okay, yeah, I could see that as a strategy. I wouldn't do it in 100 minutes, but it's like that. I mean, is that kind of what he's just trying to get, the point he's trying to get across at this point?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that all the crazy stuff that Trump is doing, he needs public opinion to do it.
Right.
You need to have the public behind him. So I think he's aware of that. I've got to keep, his approval ratings are not over 50, but they're actually higher, much higher compared to what they've been in the past. He needs to keep those numbers if he wants to keep doing, the 70 somewhat executive orders that he's done. I mean, none of that stuff works creating DOGE and stretching the limits of the Constitution.
Right.
That only works if you have the support of the public. And that's another, I think, misconception about how democracies fail is they think, oh, it's during a time of unpopularity and you get some sort of dictator that just grabs hold of power. Usually it's a popular leader that starts doing things in the name of democracy and using populist rhetoric, which we heard a lot of that in the State of the Union or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on. And people are always talk about like, well, what can the Democrats do? They don't have the House. They don't have the Senate. They don't have the White House. The only thing they could do right now for at least the next 2 years is to try to win public opinion.
Yeah.
It's really the voters right now that have the most power because once that public approval drops off, not only will it be harder to get a lot of this stuff done and, executive orders and whatnot, but you'll also have some internal conflict within the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Because then all of a sudden it's people's careers on the line and then they're not going to necessarily go along with the program. So that's my take on it. And so we're going to keep seeing, efforts to publicize things and in a way where we're doing this against the corrupt establishment and the woke left and America first. All of this stuff is the populist playbook.
Yeah. Politicians' number one objective is to get reelected. And if you get to the point where he's unpopular enough that you have members of the Senate and House who are Republicans who feel like that Trump is going to drag them down when they run for re-election 2026 or 2028, then you might see some of them begin to break with Trump and take some tough votes while they'll vote against him on whatever issue he's trying to get through the legislature.
Well, I applaud you both for hanging in that speech a lot longer, man. Rough. That was rough. All right, to wrap up, we always do a prediction. Here's a forecast. There's a big, beautiful bill that they're trying to, either the House bill or the Senate bill. Just what do you predict is going to happen there when it comes to passing this? Well, I'll back up. Will there be a government shutdown?
I'm gonna guess yes. It's not a high confidence yes, but I'll guess yes.
Brendan,
I guess I'll guess no then.
Of course,
the hot take.
Of course, he's Mr. Hot Take. He's
I don't really have anything to add. But
any other way? Yes, I think yes. It's maybe that's where Democrats finally show some backbone, and all you need is a couple Freedom Caucus people or anti-deficit people on the Republican side to protest.
Yeah, you hate to shut down the government because that does hurt people,
right?
But
they're already shutting it down.
Yeah, they're shutting down parts of it.
Yeah.
But if you, I think if Democrats are trying to win public opinion, right now Republicans control the presidency, both parts of Congress. The public is, I think, very likely to blame Republicans if the government shuts down because they have the majorities and everything.
Yeah, and just sit back. It's like that political strategy that never get in the way when your competitor is out there just making one unforced error after another. So their strategy is pretty simple: just do nothing. So then, what about the bill? Not to get into all the complexities, but there will be a bill passed? Yes or no?
I mean the budget bill?
Yeah, the budget bill. Yeah.
We'll have to pass something. I'm not super familiar with the budget process, but they'll have to pass something to fund the government. So Yeah, I think the question is how much of those cuts are they going to get for like Medicaid? Are they going to get
right.
in the budget? Because that's a situation where you're going to have the Freedom Caucus on the far right who's going to be very in favor of like big cuts to the government budget, and then you're going to have the more moderate Republicans who are in swing districts who do not want to go against Medicaid. They're going to be very reluctant to vote for that, and that's going to be an issue the Republicans have to figure out. But I think the plan is for I think what like Mike Johnson would like to have happen is that you make some cuts and then you can use those cuts to justify another round of tax cuts.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that to come. The tax cuts.
Yeah, and that'll be another show. All right. Well, thank you both. Yeah. But and thank our audience, for listening to yet another As the World Turns or Burns. And before we sign off, Producer Cheyenne, where can our audience find our podcast?
You can find us on, I think, 99.97% of all platforms.
It's everywhere.
It's
global.
everywhere.
Yep. It's and if you like us, what do we ask in return?
Give us 5 out of 5 stars.
See, we drive a hard bargain. It's a zero-sum game. We need a 5-star rating from everyone who's listening, but we appreciate everyone who does. Thank you again for listening or watching us on YouTube, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode. Take care.
This podcast is sponsored in part by Lion College and Kilt Studios. Thank you to Jonah Winter for the intro and outro music.